All right, I've got Edward Kay with me this morning. Edward, thanks for joining the show. Nice to have you on.
Nice to be here.
Edward is, as you can see in the back, a showrunner, author, writer, producer. He's done a number of things from comedy writing for television shows to book writing for children, all sorts of different things. Netflix, Comedy Network, Disney, Cartoon Network, Discovery Kids. It runs the gamut. It's pretty impressive, Ed. Thanks for joining us. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a bio, more than that, just a little bit of a, how you got to do what you're doing today.
Sure. I mean, I've had a kind of a circuitous route, and it kind of goes to show that you can have general plans, but then things happen that, especially now, like there's so much evolving technology that things I went to school for didn't exist then. Like things I'm doing now didn't exist when I was in college.
Right.
So my background was in journalism. I went to journalism school, and in the 90s, I was working as a freelance writer uh, for mostly Canadian publications, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star. I love science, so I wrote a lot of things for Canadian Geographic and um, business magazines, but with a sciencey approach to science stories that had business applications, green technology, that kind of thing. Um, and it was funny because I didn't set out to do business writing, but a friend of mine who was an editor at a business magazine asked me if I would do it. And so I did profiles of business people, and I found I really enjoyed it. And I also found that I had this interest in green energy. And there were very few business magazines writing about it. It was kind of an unknown thing. And it was kind of more something that was either in science magazines or like a lot of lefty magazines. And I realized like the people that are actually in a position to implement this green technology do not read left wing magazines, like that is not their interest. And I thought if you actually want to get your message across, the way to do it is to write for magazines that people take into the boardroom, so the Globe and Mail report on business at that time was in, that was one of their selling points for their ads. They were in the 500 biggest boardrooms in Canada and beyond. So I thought, well, that's who I should be writing for.
Mm.
And so that's what I did. And I freelanced for them for a number of years. And then that was when This Hour Has 22 Minutes was getting off the ground. And they had some really funny stand up comedians writing for the show, but they didn't have people that could really read a parliamentary budget or something like that. And the funny thing about writing for business magazines was I remember I used to write for the Globe, I wrote for the Financial Times and also Canadian Business. And I remember one of my editors saying, so if you're going to write for business, everybody finds it boring, even businessmen or businesswomen. So you seem like a funny guy. Could you try to inject some humor into your pieces? And I thought, sure, like, that's a lot more fun for me. And it's my natural orientation. So after doing that for a couple of years, that brought me to the attention of the 22 Minutes people because they were thought, who's this smart ass guy writing for the Globe and Mail? So they gave me a tryout and flew me out to Halifax. And I'd never thought about writing for television before, but I loved it. I really loved it. And it went really well. And they hired me, and I ended up staying there for 4 years as a writer and a producer. And from that, I was approached by Teletoon to do something, again, kind of different, which was to create a kids' animated comedy series because
Mm.
Teletoon was fairly new at the time and they needed some Canadian content. And it just so happened that their head of development was a big fan of This Hour Has 22 Minutes. So, it was funny. By chance, I had been asked to go speak at a school for kids with special needs. And I'd been warned by the principal that they were a bunch of little hellions and they probably would be hard to handle. And I had totally the opposite experience. Like I found them really fun. And I just thought, well, we'll do a comedy writing seminar. And I
Right.
said, we'll write jokes about whatever you want, like including
Yeah.
your teachers. And so
Ah,
they were so fun that I thought, God, like actually, I really want to write for kids now. And
yeah.
so I said yes to the Teletoon thing. And me and a couple of other people I was working with ended up creating a show called Oliver's Adventures that actually won a Gemini out of the gate on the pilot, and
Wow.
that kind of got me into creating kids television and also writing for it. I was asked to story edit a series that had been created by Gene Simmons from Kiss, and that that was another one of those things I never really set out to do,
Right.
but it was a great opportunity, a really fun show. And from that, I started getting lots of other offers, and I created a show. I co-created a show called Jimmy Two Shoes. That was kind of the big one for me. It got picked up by Disney in the
Hmm.
States and Cartoon Network for Latin markets. So that ended up going into about 80 countries
Wow.
worldwide.
Wow.
And that kind of put me on the map. And so after that, I had an interest in writing uh, novels. So I started doing that as well. And it all kind of meshed. Like one thing kind of led to another. I wrote my first novel was a kids novel that I did for Penguin Random House called Star Academy, and it was a bunch of it's kind of a sci-fi book for kids, and it just so happened there was a producer in Montreal who was like the classic story. He was at an airport, got a copy of the book while he was stuck in the departure lounge, and read it on the plane. And then I got this email said like, you don't know me, but I read your book.
Wow.
Would you be interested in creating a science show for kids with me?
Huh.
So we did that together. We created a show called Finding Stuff Out, which was for TVO kids and Discovery kids.
Huh.
And it ran for 5 seasons, did really, really well. And it was lots of fun because it used comedy to teach kids about science. And, like some people don't even realize it's a science show. They just think it's a comedy. But
Right.
it won a lot of awards, and the one I'm proudest of was that it was twice nominated. It was a finalist for the Japan Prize for excellence in science education.
Huh.
So that was really fun. We were up against some pretty stiff competition, so
Yeah.
that was a thrill. And then from there, I created a series of books for Kids Can Press called Gross Science, and Shaftesbury Films has just now adapted them for television. So that's kind of like that's my published stuff. And then
Right.
while I was working on that series, like this is often how it goes with these things. Like while you're working on something else, you come across information that you can't necessarily use for that project,
Sure.
but you file it away. And when I was working on the Gross Science series, some of it was to do. I mean, it sounds kind of esoteric, but it was germs, and it was like the history of them and how it affected North American history. And while I was researching it, I discovered all this indigenous stem from the pre-contact era, which is before Columbus came to the
Mm.
Americas. So I just kept finding this amazing indigenous science, like medicine, technology, you name it, like, and from all these different indigenous nations. And I thought, can't believe that nobody's ever done a book about this before.
Right.
So I contacted my agent, and she said, well, do some research, really make sure there's nothing like this.
Right.
And I did. Like, there was one very academic journal type thing, and for professors, but nothing for kids. So anyway, I realized, because I'm non-indigenous, that I would need an indigenous partner. So I, put the word out, and my agent found a really wonderful co-author for me, Deidre Haverlock, who's from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta. And she was coincidentally doing a book about the science of the buffalo hunt. So it was kind of a perfect match, and we really hit it off. We still work together on other projects.
Mhm.
So we came up with this idea for a kind of a survey book about indigenous STEM from the pre-contact era. Um, and we ended up like literally within 6 days of it going out into the market, we had a bidding war in the United
Wow.
States.
Wow.
And so it came out, it's called Indigenous Ingenuity, in fact. It is coincidental. I was working on something else today, and I have a copy of it here. So
Excellent.
that's the book. It's an American book, so it's probably getting more attention in the United States than it is here. It's ironic because the editor in New York is also a Canadian and Indigenous, and so we have three Canadians, two Indigenous people, but it still gets treated like an American book.
Right.
But that's okay. It's doing really well down there. The sales have been really, really strong, and
Great.
we're adapting it for television now with a
Wonderful.
company called Eagle Vision, which has, I mean, they're the biggest Indigenous-owned television production company in Canada, and they've been around a long time. Like, been around about 25 years and done
Mhm.
service work as well as original stuff. So
Yeah.
it's a really great match. So that's my day to day job
Yeah.
right now is adapting this book for television.
Exciting. Wow. That's fantastic. That's I'm just a little bit in awe, taking it all in. It's such a wide variety, which I guess, I find a lot of creative people love that variety, not doing the same thing over and over and over again. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it makes creative people even stronger when they have multiple influences, when they've traveled and worked in different genres. Um, I think, I remember talking to a copywriter years ago, award-winning copywriter at an ad agency, and he said he felt his best writing started after he was 40 years of age. He'd
Mm.
been in the advertising industry his whole life, but he said it was just, he said, I needed more life experience. I needed more miles on the clock to be able to really write, properly and a little deeper, he felt. So
I
interesting.
totally agree with that. I mean, because I think a lot of it for me is just having the life experience to also the life experience to recognize a good story.
Right.
Like um, it's not something that I was born with. I mean, I had some good editors. I mean, I started writing professionally when I was 19, and
Mm.
I was writing for a magazine in Ottawa called Ottawa Magazine, and I also interned at a paper that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, called the Ottawa Journal. And it was great. Like, I was 19, I had daily deadlines, even though I was an unpaid intern. And, you had to crank out a story a day, or else
Yeah.
they didn't want you even for free.
Yeah.
So it was really good training.
Right.
And but having said that, I don't think it was till I was in my 30s when I was at 22 minutes that I really started to develop as a writer. And
Yeah.
part of that was just the pressure, like it's amazing, like having to create a show every week from scratch is incredibly difficult. And
Right.
the funny thing is we used to come in heavy every week, which means like we would have more material, we would
Yeah.
shoot more material than we could air. And that was always painful because some of the material that we cut was brilliant, but
Right. Right.
it would it wouldn't get on because uh, sometimes there was just a bigger story because it
Yeah.
responded to real news.
Yeah.
So there might be a piece that was funnier, but it wasn't actually addressing something that was a serious news story. So it would get shunted aside. Um, and there's many reasons why things don't make it to air, and sometimes it's just not as funny because we shot in front of a live audience, which was
Yeah.
great. Because I always use the analogy, it's like a light switch. When you have a live audience, there's none of these arguments with executives about whether something's funny or not. Like,
Right.
sometimes you're right, sometimes they're right, but it's like the light switch: funny, not funny, funny, not funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you have 200 people and they're not laughing, then it's not funny. And if they're
Right.
laughing, then it is. Like, there's nothing to argue about. So
Yeah.
uh, it's really fun to have that was my training in comedy, was in front of 200 people that
Yeah.
may or may not laugh at what I wrote.
Yeah.
So that was a good introduction to it.
Yeah, I was thinking safer than doing stand up, right? At least you're not just standing on the stage trying to
Yeah,
deliver
I
a
mean,
line
the
and
other people, so I mean,
yeah.
it's almost worse in a way, though. Like, if you're writing something for Rick Mercer and then they don't laugh, it's like, oh my God, that's on me,
Right. Right.
but
Right.
no, I think ultimately it's tougher to be the person on the stage for sure.
Yeah. And did you work with Mary Walsh back in the day too, or?
I did. Yeah,
Yeah.
I worked with with Mary. I'm still in touch with her as well. Like
Right.
she's a very well, both her and Rick are really creative people, and they both have a lot of creative energy. So I
Yeah.
think either one of them is going away.
No, no, for sure. I'm curious too with the actors on the show at the time. Would they get involved with the writing a lot, or was it more like you had a writer's room with a designated group of writers doing their thing? And then, what does that look like if I had to, draw like a pipeline, or where do they come in? And do they read with you and then pitch back, or is it collaborative, or is it more like here we've got the writing way to
A bit
go?
of both, actually. I would say that there was no one way. Um, I remember, I could tell you this much, like when I got my tryout, um, I got a call on Monday, and that's normally the day that they start writing the show. And they said, "Can you be ready to come down here tomorrow afternoon to fly to Halifax from Toronto?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "Come up with some ideas because we're going to have our first read through on Wednesday.
Right. Wow.
You don't have any ideas, it's not going to look good." So I just started writing my ass off. And they had this thing, they had this Wednesday afternoon read that I was warned in advance. It's called the Humiliatorium. And so it was in the CBC radio room in Halifax. And you walked in and you would write your copy, and you would assign it to whoever you thought would be the best match for it of the four cast members. And the producer, generally would match it unless they thought somebody else was better suited to a different actor. And then they would read it. And so there would be all the writers, all the actors, all the producers, and then the technical staff would be there too.
Mm.
Because even if something was funny, they would have to make a decision about whether, given the available resources, we could actually shoot something. Like,
Mm.
like let's say you wanted 10 RCMP mannequins. Like, well, we just don't have that in the
Right.
budget. So if
Right.
you wrote a piece that asked for too much, like they'd say, look, it's really funny, but we don't have those resources. So you have to either find some way to dial it down, or
Right.
or write something else. And so anyway, the actors would read the jokes, and it was like that light switch, funny not funny. Like if you wrote something and people didn't laugh, like it just didn't get on the show.
Yeah.
And um it was especially tense because everybody got a 2-week tryout.
Wow.
And um if and basically if you didn't hit the mark enough in those 2 weeks, they just
Right.
put you on the plane back to Toronto. And it was like it just reminded me of those movies you see of the Depression where they have the tough guy competition that goes
Right.
from town to town. And if
Right.
you think you're tough, you step into the ring,
Right.
and the guy just grabs you like that. And you'd I felt, like it'd be they were always trying out new writers. And
Yeah.
so every week, every 2 weeks, there'd be somebody new. And some of them are really good stand-ups,
Yeah.
like way better than me as far as their own act. But
Yeah.
see, I never was a stand-up. I wrote
Right.
for other people.
Yeah.
So I would mimic other people's voices and I'd write material for them.
Ah.
But one of the things that you learned really quickly was that if you wanted to succeed, you had to learn to mimic the voice of a particular actor, use the kind of adjectives they'd use,
Mm.
use the kind of punchlines. So sometimes you'd get really seasoned comedians coming in and they'd bomb because they were so used to writing for themselves
Right.
that they couldn't adapt their writing style for
Yeah.
other writers. And that's something that carries over into any kind of drama or comedy that
Yeah.
you write, like as a writer, as opposed to being a comedian. You have
Yeah.
to be able to write for other people. It's not enough. Like, no matter how good your voice is,
Right.
if it doesn't line up with who you're writing for, it's going to sound strange,
Yeah.
and you're going to get stuck on that plane back to Toronto.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wonder too, if your early days helped with that because you had to, write stories for newspaper and you're never given the same topic twice, probably. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I worked at newspapers and magazines in my early days, and I was always amazed. We'd have, 6 or 8 writers and a couple editors around a table, and we had a weekly magazine, but bashing out ideas similar. Um, and there were people that really had a style, a distinct style. They were going to write feature articles only, and then there were others that could flex from news to features to whatever. Um, but there were limits, and to your point too, some people were hilariously funny, but it didn't translate to their writing. And I,
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, that is very true. There are some people that are just funnier in the room.
yeah,
Or,
yeah, and
um,
it's like, how do you harness that? How do you put that person on stage instead and have somebody write for them? Maybe, and I don't know. I'm not sure.
and there are people. Well, that is sometimes how it works. Like there are certain actors who um, aren't necessarily the strongest writers, um, but if you wrote something for a certain actor, you just knew they'd hit it out of the park.
Right,
You
right,
know?
yeah,
And even though they weren't the strongest writer, they would just totally kill with anything you gave them,
yeah,
as long as they were invested in it.
yeah,
And, and then there's other, I always like to credit Rick Mercer because one of the things people always ask me is, did he really write those rants? Because it seems like such a signature piece.
right,
And he did. And
right,
he's, like anything he does in the way of those rants, it's really interesting. Like I wrote tons of stuff for him, but never those because he's, if he said, I got an idea for a rant, he's like, no, I don't want to hear it. Like, like, because then, like, that was his brand,
right, right,
and it was really sacrosanct to him that it be his voice and it be totally him.
yeah,
And that's probably the purest expression of his voice is those
mm,
rants.
hmm,
Um, and so like those, I always give him 100% credit. Like every
right,
single word of those was written by him. But
yeah, yeah,
um, as a writer, you know, you want people that don't write everything for
right.
themselves, because then that gives you an opportunity to write for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of Rick Mercer, you've caught him sometimes ad-libbing on camera, and he just seems to me to be quite witty, sharp, funny all the time. Thinks quickly on his feet. If something goes a little sideways, he seems to just roll with it. There's never a, oh, no, what do I do now? You know, so very versatile in that sense, I think. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, Edward, I'm curious, writing for kids television, is it something that you want to do more of? And it sounds like you've certainly enjoyed it for sure. And I'll just do a little segue into children's television. Is that something down the road that you want to do more of?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of projects in development now. Um, I mean, one of the things I've just joined the Canadian Media Producers Association. And so I felt like after 2+ decades in the industry, I was ready to take the plunge. So um, my eldest son is also a writer, and he had some interesting ideas for shows. And we started working together on things. And, one of them has been optioned by a major broadcaster. And I, in a way, I kind of got a little nudge because the broadcaster said, why don't you be the producer on this
Uh,
instead of going to another company so we can just do this direct? And at first I thought, oh no, like those XLS things, I've got to learn spreadsheets and filling forms, and it was like, a bit of an uphill slog for a couple of weeks, but I learned it. And then I thought, that, now that I've done that, it's kind of a shame not to do something with it now that I know how to do the less fun parts of the business. Um, and anyway, so I decided to, so this is really new. Like this is actually in the last week I've joined. And so my plan is to partner. First of all, I find collaborations really fun. Like I may have started out, in a newsroom, but 22 Minutes was very collaborative. And every single show that I've ever, original show that I've created, it's always been a collaboration of one form or another. And um, even my books are collaboration, like the gross science books. there's an illustrator, an animation director named Mike Shield who created the illustrations for them, which are a really important part of the book because kids might necessarily, yeah, I mean, the books are funny, the text is funny, but you know, really young kids like 8 or 9 years old might not pick up a book about germs if it didn't have a really funny illustration on it,
Sure.
and then throughout. So, um, and then diversity is more and more important. You know, as people from traditionally underrepresented communities are demanding voices, and you know, fair enough, like good for them. And so I have found that I just find it personally more enriching to work with people, like working with the, for example, working with Deidre Haverlock, who, as I said, is Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Like, there's um, there's obviously lots of commonality, but there's also certain cultural things that are different, like just things like sense of humor, you know, and it's really fascinating, you know, to hear Deidre's take on certain things. Like sometimes she'll make me laugh just from the way she'll say something, you
Mm.
know, like really colloquial. Like she'll write dialogue for a character, and it just sounds like something one of my uncles would have said when I was a kid. Like there's just like some people just have this natural, and I think Indigenous culture is tends to be very down to earth,
Mm.
and so you know, a lot of Indigenous writers that I've worked with have a real gift for dialogue, and so it's just fun to listen to, and it makes you think, oh yeah, right, I have to make a mental note, like that kind of thing, you know.
Mhm.
And or, and this is germane to thing about kids books, like what I'm told by Deidre and is that Indigenous parents tend to try to let their kids make mistakes, and like they're not, it's not like free range chickens, it's more like they are watching over them, but they won't be didactic, like
Mm.
they'll only insert themselves if they think somebody's going to get hurt, you know.
Right, right,
Otherwise they feel like experiential learning
right.
is the strongest learning, and that's a really fascinating, because I mean that's obviously, I write a lot of nonfiction for kids, and I've studied um, mnemonics and ways of learning. It's something I've spent a lot of time on. And it really interests me that there's cultural differences around how people learn.
Mhm.
And, you know, it's not necessarily more effective. But what I always like is combinations of things, like taking the most effective elements of different cultures. And my eldest son is trans male and also on the autism spectrum. So you know, it's been really interesting working on a show which um, is based loosely on his life, and I've learned a lot. And
Mm.
that's also inspired me to want to do. I'm working on a book right now called "How to Survive Life" for kids, and it's for all kids. And like, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity or uh, gender or cultural orientation or anything, or whether you're autistic or neurotypical. It's really designed for all kids, but I'm trying to take everything I've learned from all these different cultures and all these different people, and I'm working with a child psychologist, Dr. Megan Yarmy, um, so that I have my science. You know, the clinical aspect is solid. Anyway, I
Yeah.
just, you know, I thought it would be interesting and meaningful for kids to take everything that I've learned and sort of put it into a guidebook, you know,
Mm.
for like having a neurodiverse kid, having a kid who's autistic, you know, like it's horrifying when you find out that your kid actually thought about committing suicide and didn't tell you, you know. And I've had these conversations, and I thought, you know, it made me really passionate about creating materials that obviously entertain kids, but also are meaningful and help them
Mm.
navigate through life.
Mm.
So, and then, for example, like having an Indigenous writing partner on certain projects, you know, I discover things that I didn't know about, you know, that certain ways of knowing that are useful for kids, and also challenges that other kids have. So I find that like I've tried to really embrace diversity in a meaningful way, like not ticking boxes, which I really hate because you see
Right.
so much of that now and it's really
Yeah.
cynical. But if you can work with people who are genuinely talented, like, you're not choosing them because they're this, you're choosing them because they're the best person in the room for
Right.
this particular project. It's so enriching, you learn so much, and
Yeah.
projects just come out so much better.
Hmm. Fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, it's a different day, isn't it? The talk about diversity has never been so strong as it has been in the last several years. 30 years ago, it wasn't on the nose of anything. It didn't come up in traditional media and in the channels that were the main sort of status quo broadcasters. And I'm warmed by the fact that I remember getting interviewed in Montreal at a studio by a Netflix executive, and one of his first couple questions were things like, "How many people of color are on the production team in management roles? How many women do you have in management roles?" And it was um, they'd never asked those questions before. You could feel the mandate. It was right up front, um, and I've taken diversity training workshops and things, and it's fascinating to me to hear the conversations that come up. Some people are really wrestling with certain items or they're struggling. Um, I remember one a couple years ago where this fellow had been thrown into this program by his boss because I can only imagine what he was like at work, but his boss like volunteered him for this program and he was angry, really angry. One of these guys that was just not understanding why divergent voices and people speaking from minorities, underrepresented. He couldn't understand why this was relevant. So we had to dance around him in the seminars and these workshops a lot to try and, we didn't want to condemn the man, but we were hoping to open a window somewhere where he'd go, oh, now I get it. But it was, things that we hadn't done in the past as much. I think we've done portions and pieces, but it's fascinating to see that. And, exactly to your point of uh, the cultural differences and the humor that come out of different cultures is sometimes we lose that or we miss that in the status quo in the sort of mainstream, and it's sometimes just as funny or funnier. And so it's nice to have this sort of enrichment of ideas and cultures coming out more today.
Yeah, I totally agree, and one of the things that's also interesting is, um, I mean, there are these different takes that people have, but there's also these commonalities, like trans people who are autistic also find it awkward standing on elevators going up to the 30th floor when no one knows what the hell to say to each other,
Right,
like,
right,
and in fact, like if someone is on the autism spectrum, they can usually write that kind of stuff really funny because, like, I guarantee if you're neurotypical, um, and you're awkward in a certain social situation, like just amp that up,
right,
like
right,
it's like a quantum leap of anxiety if you're on the autism spectrum. So like there's the potential for real comedy from that. Like,
right.
like that's the thing. Like ideally, like this is true of all my writing partners. Like we just kill ourselves laughing when we're working on this stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's actually quite liberating, like there's a lot of good just purely from self-interest, there's a lot of good material to be mined, like
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
actually work with people and collaborate and listen to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it often makes me think of like Far Side cartoons or, that sort of thing where Gary Larson would have this viewpoint on something that was just, it'd kill you. You just see a cartoon, you'd just be dying laughing. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? The fact that, back to your light switch analogy, it's like you knew he was going to deliver time and time again. He was going to just, knock you out of your socks most of the time with these cartoons. So, um, Edward, I'm just conscious of time. I wondered, do you want to talk about anything down the road? Have you got some aspirations? I know you've got a couple projects in development, um, and also sort of if there are any projects near and dear to your heart, if you want to reflect either backwards or forwards, things you'd love to work on in the future. based on what you've
Um,
worked on in the past?
yeah, I mean, more and more, it's funny because it's what you were saying earlier. Like, as you get older, you develop your voice more and more. And um, I don't know what project I was working on, but I came across some science research one time that was data driven. That I can't remember what the data was, but that according to whoever I read it from, their study, that there were certain professions. I mean, this comes up in sciences all the time, right? Because there's uh, kind of it's more than a hypothesis. It's pretty much data driven that most scientists do their best work in their 20s and 30s,
Mm,
and then it kind of peters out. And it's not that uh, there's all kinds of theories about why this is. That
mm,
whatever it is that enables you to think creatively as a scientist in your 20s and 30s, that cognitive function starts tapering off as you get older. And so, conversely, um, judges and writers are two professions where apparently quantitatively
yeah.
the the work improves. And I can understand it. I mean, I actually do have a friend who's a judge, and she has to juggle or absorb so much new information constantly because it's criminal law, and so there's constantly new precedents, and there's decisions made in other courts, and because of our system of common law, when a decision is made in one court, it influences decisions made subsequently in other courts. So you have to constantly adapt, and I really believe in this Japanese concept of kaizen. And so I'm actually starting a post grad program at Metro Toronto University next year in media production.
Mm,
And so I take courses all the time, just to kind of keep my brain active and on top of the stuff I write about. So, I guess just doing more things all the time, like the How to Survive Life book, is really important to me, just because, I mean, I also do work out in schools. I've done outreach work for my science shows, but I've also done presentations when I'm asked on germ theory and stuff like that. And just being around children and having my own kids, you realize that there's certain needs that children have that are not really being addressed by the system.
mm,
And it's not a question of pointing the finger at anybody. I mean, I think a lot of the time, schools just don't have the resources or the time to do a lot of this stuff.
mm,
Uh, so being able to genuinely help kids with uh, mental health and emotional health, but um, beyond that, like helping them be successful as humans, like for whatever their goal is,
mm,
helping them be more creative, be more resilient. Those things are really, really important to me.
yeah.
And I used to love 22 Minutes because it's a form of social satire and it makes you laugh. But what you're really trying to do is make the world a better place by pointing out what's wrong with it and pointing it out in a way that's fun instead of like swallowing a pill, and
Yeah.
so I guess I just want to do more of those kinds of things, and indigenous ingenuity, I'm hoping, will go to screen, and I'm hoping to do many, many years of it. I'd like it to go 5 or 10 seasons because
Mm,
it's really quite amazing how much indigenous STEM there is out there. um,
mm,
and like I said, I want to work with um, more creators. I mean, like, you know, queer, neurodiverse, uh, BIPOC. I mean, I do a lot of all this now. I just
mm,
want to do more,
right,
because
right.
one of the things, and I guess this is one thing I would say that I really recommend collaborations, because it's not just that, it's the right thing to do, but it does enrich you as a writer to
Mm,
have these other experiences. But the other thing it does is, you don't have to do everything yourself. Like if you're working Like right now, I'm working on about 6 different projects with 6 different
Wow.
co-creators.
Yeah.
And so you can sort of amplify your creative output
Yeah.
by not trying to do everything yourself, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
and you improve the quality of it, but you also improve the quantity. So, I mean, I'm always, I have a number of creators I really enjoy working with, and most of them are diverse, like whatever, all sorts of different diversity. But um, that is probably my goal, plus setting up this company, and being part of the CMPA and
Mhm.
doing more of that. I want to start, developing more projects and not to get too technical, but as Bill C11 starts to have more effect and we start to see streamers doing more Canadian content, that's something I want to be involved in
Great.
creating.
Excellent. Good. All right. Well, look, we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate the chat. Lovely to get to know you and hear about all the things going on in your life, and I look forward to maybe catching up in a year or so and seeing what's evolved. And I'm sure you'll have even more stories to tell. So thank you once again, Edward. It's a pleasure having you on.
It's my pleasure, Lance.
All right. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.